Okay. Well, we're going to get into Isaiah. Ty's going to lead us in prayer, and then we will get into looking at the book. Okay. It is a Wednesday night, and we get to study the book of Isaiah. Like, life is good, right? Um, so, I had you read chapter 6 through chapter 12 2 weeks ago. I made it through a chapter and a half, which was just really solid on my part. So we're going to be picking up at chapter 7, but the goal is to make it through chapter 12 today. As we've discussed before, we're on a little bit of a time crunch with covering Isaiah. We're not trying to cover the whole book. We're just trying to cover chunks of it that have specific pertinence to Jesus. But this section, chapter 7 through 12, has an awful lot of pertinence to Jesus. In fact, this is sometimes referred to as the Emmanuel section of the book of Isaiah. So, Emmanuel is a word that means God with us, and it shows up multiple times within the text here in these chapters 7 and 8 in particular. And the context to this is King Ahaz. And Ahaz, if you go to 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 2, was an evil king. So he was not doing what was right in God's eyes. And at the time, in chapter 7, we find that Syria and the northern kingdom have teamed up. And they have decided that they are going to go down and try and attack the southern kingdom, where Ahaz is king and Isaiah is a prophet. And so the context to this is that they are gathering up to go and fight them. And both of those, individually, Syria or the northern kingdom, would be strong enough to take the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, on their own. And so for them to team up and have an agreement that they're going to go down and defeat them, it is basically just a wash. Okay, we're going to lose. So you begin to gather your armies. You decide we're going to go to war and we're going to do the best we can. And then in this section, you get down to verse 10. And this is where it gets interesting, and we're introduced to this Emmanuel prophecy. It says, "Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." So since Ahaz is a bad king, and he says, I'll not put the Lord to the test, you have to keep in context that phrase that normally you would associate with a very positive attitude, right? That's what Jesus says in the wilderness, is no, you don't put the Lord your God to the test. But in this context, unlike Jesus, who Satan is saying, go and test God and ask for something, the one who is telling Ahaz to ask for something isn't Satan, it's God himself. And when God tells you, I want you to ask for something, you just ask for it, a sign. And I'll give you a sign that you're going to win this battle, this unwinnable battle against these two foes. I'll give you whatever sign you want, ask for it as high as heaven or as deep as Sheol. When God says that, what you do is you ask for a big sign. That's what you do. Because God has told you to do that. Ahaz, on the other hand, says, no, and kind of demurs with this, I wouldn't put the Lord God to the test. In reality, though, it's wearying. This is another example of this king not trusting God, not taking God seriously, and not taking the prophets seriously. And so in verse 13, it says, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? So Ahaz was a king that was wearisome to his subjects. He's wearisome to those who had to deal with him, but now he's also wearisome to God. God says, just ask for a sign and I'll give it to you. And Ahaz goes, oh, no, I won't do that. And that's wearying to God. So God says, I will give you a sign. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. So Ahaz doesn't get to choose the sign. God instead is going to choose the sign for him. And he says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Emmanuel. And he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose 2 kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. So here is the sign. You wouldn't ask for a sign, so God's going to give you a sign instead. And the sign is there's going to be a virgin with child, and he's going to be named Emmanuel. Who is that? That's obviously Christ, isn't it? Right? In Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, this exact verse will be quoted, and it will be stated as being fulfilled in Jesus. So now here's my question for you. And this is what makes this passage a difficult passage. How on earth is that a sign for Ahaz? Because Ahaz has been told, I'm going to give you a sign that these 2 nations are going to come and fight against you, and they're going to lose. How is Jesus being born 700 years later going to be a sign to Ahaz? Do you see the problem with that? You see the difficulty there? Now we know that this is fulfilled in Jesus because the New Testament says so. But we also know that it's a sign given to Ahaz. And Ahaz was supposed to learn something from this. So these 2 things are what make this one of the most difficult passages of prophecy in all of the book of Isaiah and really all of the Old Testament. So I'm going to do my best to muddle through it. But I want you to understand that good men have disagreed with this in a multiplicity of different ways. One view of it was that this is a kind of a dual prophecy thing, that what you have is actually there's going to be a woman, not a virgin, just a woman who will have a child. And some people even think that is Isaiah's wife. And she will have a child. And before that child is old enough to choose what food he eats, whether he eats curds and honey or not, these things would happen. I don't particularly subscribe to that. And there's several different reasons for that. One of them simply being is that word virgin it's translated in only one translation is it translated woman or maiden. In every other translation it's translated virgin, and I think rightfully so. I don't think the idea of saying, well, there's going to be a woman and she's going to have a child, she's going to name that child Emmanuel, and that's a sign to you. One, it doesn't match the text. That word virgin means virgin. And then the other thing is that's not much of a sign, right? A woman's going to have a child and name that kid Emmanuel. Could somebody do that today? A woman just have a child and then name the child Emmanuel. That's not a sign, right? That's not anything special. I think what the sign is Jesus. There is going to be a child who will be born to a virgin and will be named Emmanuel, which means what? God is with us. Yeah, that's right. It means God is with us. That child is Jesus. Matthew tells us that. But the sign that he's being given is a time frame here. Now, you ask for a sign, I'm going to give you a sign, and Jesus being born of a virgin, is that a sign? Is that an impressive thing from God? That's definitely miraculous, right? Does it do Ahaz a whole lot of good, though? No. Did Ahaz have a chance to ask for a sign that would do him a lot of good? Yes, and he chose not to do that. So God says, I will give you a sign, and all that he gets out of the sign is the amount of time before, he says, he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. Now, this might be he's old enough to choose to do the right thing versus doing the wrong thing. It might even be as simple as he's old enough to choose what food he wants. You think about a baby. In the very beginning, babies just, whatever mom and dad give them is what that kid eats. I remember we were given formula to one of our kids, and I tasted it one time, and I thought, that's disgusting. But the kid didn't think it was disgusting. The kid just ate it. But then there comes a point where they begin to say, oh, okay, I want that. Right? I don't want that thing. I want the honey. I'm old enough to have an opinion about what I eat, and I'll shove the rest off of my high chair. Right? That time span is a very short amount of time. And the time span for Ahaz before he starts to have a real problem, which is that you don't need to worry about Syria anymore. You don't need to worry about the 10 tribes anymore. Who you need to worry about is, down in verse 17, who's he going to send up against him? King of Assyria. Not Syria, Assyria. This is one of those ones we can get confused on. Syria is a place and Assyria is an entire empire. What I think is being said here is, okay, Ahaz, you could have asked for any sign. You could have asked for all the different signs that previous kings had asked for. Make the shadow go backwards, stop the sun in the sky. Any number of things you could have asked for. You didn't ask. So I'll give you a sign. There's going to be a child born to a virgin. That's a miraculous thing. His name will be God is with us. And all you get out of that sign is, by the time, in the amount of time it takes that child to go from birth to being able to choose the good and the evil, that's how much time you left before you have Assyria coming. In other words, you don't have to worry about Syria and the northern kingdom. I've told you, what am I going to do with them? What did God say to him, I'll do with Syria and the northern kingdom? They're not going to be a problem for you. I'll defeat them. But you do have another problem. And that problem is Assyria, and it's not going to be long before that comes and becomes an issue for you. But for us, the exciting thing is that God says, okay, you didn't ask for a sign, so I'll give you a sign, and it's not much use to Ahaz other than a rebuke, but how big of a sign is that to us? That's a huge thing, isn't it? That's an immense blessing that God has given to us through this moment with Ahaz. So God flings forward into the future and says, there's going to come somebody, and he's going to save my people, and he's going to be God is with us, and he's going to do great things. But is that going to help you, Ahaz? Nope, not going to help you a whit, right? You could have had some help from me, but instead you chose not to. Anybody have any comments or questions on that section? Okay. So then you continue down, and he lays down the things that are going to happen in the future here for the nation. In that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt, for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They'll all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rock and all the thorn bushes and all the pastures. What God is saying is, look, I'm going to come in here, and all of this land is it's going to be a land where the flies and the bees and the bugs, they take over again. In verse 21, in that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep, and because of the abundance of milk that they give, he'll eat curds. For everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. Now, curds and honey we think of as a very good thing. It's like, oh, those are tasty things, right? You go and buy honey, and that's a sweet thing. Curds, that's something that people will go to the grocery store and, oh, that's fancy food, even though it's waiting to be cheese. But here it's used in a negative context. And this is tied, I think, to this prophecy, because in the prophecy, the curds and honey is the time frame, isn't it? Right? Before that child can choose the evil or the good, and before it eats curds and honey. Well, the people in the land, he says Assyria is going to come down, and the people who are left in the land, they're going to eat curds and honey. But they're going to eat curds and honey not because it's a delicacy, but because that's the only option they have. Because they're going to gather some of the beasts of the field, the sheep and the goat, and they're going to be able to get honey because honey's from the wild bees, but that's all they can have because all the fields will be laid waste. They're not going to have wheat. They're not going to have crops. They're not going to have a booming economy. Assyria is going to come in and the land will be desolate. And the reason you're eating curds and honey is not because, wow, we've got such luxury, but because that's all that you have. That makes sense? So he's making that point. He said, look, he's going to come in, and in fact, he says he'll shave it like a razor. And so the king of Assyria is just going to come shave the land so that that's the only option that is left. And he'll talk about how there'll be briars and there'll be thorns and there'll be all sorts of things that begin to cover the land. Down verse 25, as for all the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briar and thorns, but they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. So now, he's laid out this prophecy about Assyria, but baked into the prophecy about Assyria. See, if you're reading Isaiah in the time period, this is a prophecy that you care about because you're thinking about the things going on in your life right then. But baked into that whole section that's dealing with Assyria is going to come and these are the things that are going to happen to you. And by the way, why is Assyria coming and why are these things going to happen? If you had to boil it down to one word for the sin of the nation at that time, what's the one word? It's idolatry. That's right. So that's the problem. And Isaiah spends a lot of his time dealing with idolatry. But inside dealing with all of that, you get these things that get thrown in that also point us towards Jesus. And Emmanuel is certainly one of them. So now you move on to chapter 8. So when you look in chapter 8, we start out this chapter, and now we're going to have more talk about the Assyrian invasion, but also more talk about the Emmanuel. The Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it in common characters belonging to Maher Shalal Hashbaz and Gesundheit. And I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, to attest for me. Now that big long word means swift is the booty and speedy is the prey. The idea here is what's going to happen is it's going to happen fast. So you are right now, you are thinking about one enemy, and the enemy you're concerned about is Syria, and then that northern kingdom, and that's what you have on your mind. But things are going to happen quickly. It's going to get very dark for you very fast. And so in verse 3, I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. Now, when it says Isaiah went to the prophetess and she conceived and bore a son, most people think that prophetess was probably Isaiah's wife. And that's what we're referring to here. Is just he had a son, and his son gets that name, Maher Shalal Hashbaz. And you think about, why would he name his son that? What's the value in naming his son that? That, by the way, is the second son that he's named a weird name, right? If you go back to chapter 6, he named one son, a remnant shall return. What's the point of Isaiah's children being named these strange names? What? Yeah, it's like Hosea with his kids. Every time you see the kid and the name is said, people go, why did you name your child that? And he says, that's a really good point. You got a half hour for a sermon? And so it gives him a chance to continue to share the message and to continue to tell people about what God is going to do. So verse 4, before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Now, Samaria, that's the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. Damascus is the capital of Syria. These are the two nations that Judah is worried about attacking them. And what's chapter 8 saying is going to happen to those two nations, to their capitals, Damascus and Samaria? Down there in verse 4, what's their wealth and will become a spoil for who? Yeah, Assyria. So in other words, you don't need to worry about them. You need to worry about Assyria. I'm not sending small dogs to come and beat you. I'm going to be sending a big dog to beat on you. And he's a much bigger problem. And he's going to go through and take care of Syria and the northern 10 tribes first. Now, why is he going to take care of those northern 10 tribes? What's the purpose of Assyria attacking the northern 10 tribes of Israel? Yeah, it's punishment on the northern kingdom. And you go to the other prophets, you go to prophets like Amos and Hosea who spoke to the northern kingdom, and they talk about that in greater detail, that Assyria is going to come and wipe you out. So Isaiah is down in the southern kingdom, and he's telling them, this is what's going to happen, and Assyria is going to cause problems for you too. Now, if you go down, and you look then in verse 8, here's Assyria, because let's start verse 6. Because this people has refused the waters of Shiloh that flow gently, and rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. These are the two leaders of Syria and the northern kingdom. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria in all his glory, and it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks, and it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. So, the first thing is, he says, Assyria is going to come in, and it's going to take out the land of Rezin and Remaliah, which is Syria and the northern kingdom. They're going to get wiped out, going to get flooded by Assyria. But just like when a river floods, it overflows its banks, and it affects other things like coming over the road, doesn't it? So not only does the river flood, but then all this other land gets impacted by it as well. And he says, so the flood of Assyria, it's going to come not just through Syria, not just through the northern kingdom of Israel, but it's going to reach even down to you, Judah. And how far up is that flood water going to go? If you look down there in verse 8, he says it's going to reach even to where? Even to your neck. Yeah, right up to your neck. Now, what is likely the significance of water reaching the neck? When water reaches your neck, what does it not do? It doesn't drown you, right? Is that fair? Right? You're up to your neck. And in fact, we even use phrases like that. I'm just up to my neck in work right now. The stress of what's going on in my life is just like I'm just barely holding on. And we'll even use that kind of thing. But up to the neck is not a mortal wound, is it? So Assyria is going to come down to Judah, and they're going to flood into the land. And they do. They take over big chunks of Judah. But they will not conquer them completely. Who's going to do that? Who's going to actually conquer Judah? It'll be Babylon. That's right. Babylon will do that. But they're going to flood in there, and now here's the point that points to Jesus. It's going to flood the land, Assyria will, even up to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land. So here's another picture he's given. One's a flood picture. The other is the idea of a bird, and the bird spreads its wings out. And it's going to spread its wings all over Judah too. And it says it's going to spread its wings, Assyria will, over your land. Whose land is it? O Emmanuel. Whose land does that belong to? It belongs to God. And who's Emmanuel? You know it from the New Testament. Jesus. That's Jesus' land. That's His place. Those are His people. So when Assyria comes in and they are getting them right up to the neck, who's okay with that? It's Jesus, isn't it? Jesus, that's what that text is saying, is the one who will come and save you someday, be born of a virgin and come and save the whole world, He's the same one who's saying, send Assyria in, up to their neck, maybe they'll learn a lesson or two. We must not forget that Jesus is, He's both the God that saves on the cross, and He's also a disciplining God. Yeah, Mike? For sure. Yes. The Assyria is the disciplinary rod, right? But the threat is within. The problem is not Assyria. The problem is idolatry. They've turned their back on God, and God says, okay, if your heart doesn't change, I'll flood the land with Assyria. And now we will skip big chunks of God's rebuke of other nations. But Assyria is one of those other nations, and God does not think highly of Assyria. It's not like, oh, Assyria is a really righteous nation, and Judah is a wicked nation. Assyria is very wicked. But God's going to use a wicked nation to discipline His people so that He can drive idolatry out of them. So yeah, they're the disciplinary rod, absolutely. The problem is within, absolutely. Okay, so in verse 9, be broken, you peoples, and be shattered. So why is all this happening? Be broken, you peoples, and give ear, all you far countries. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Take counsel together, but it will speak a word, but it will not stand. For God. Now this entire passage is there to state what God is doing. And as Mike said, the problem is within. If you are with God, you're going to be okay. But if you are not with God, strap on your armor. You get your war council together. Get your best warriors together. Make your battle strategy. Figure out the best plan to win. And I'll shatter it. None of that's going to work. God wants for those who will not stand with Him to have their might shattered, to have their man-made wisdom shattered. Why? To bring them to repentance. You cannot repent until you're broken and contrite, can you? There has to be a shattering. There has to be a breaking down of that pride of we'll do it with our chariots and our horses and our battlefield. So instead, God is seeking a people who will be shattered. Now, when they go off into Babylon, that's exactly what will happen. And if you have any doubt as to whether or not it works to remove idolatry, God's plan to shatter them and eventually put them into Babylonian captivity for 70 years, look at the nation of Israel when Jesus shows up on the scene. Now, they have a lot of problems. They have Pharisees, they've got the chief priests, they've got all sorts of wrapped up in traditions and legalism and all sorts of pride. But the one thing they don't have is idolatry. By the time you get to the New Testament, are the people in the land worshiping Baal and Molech or anything like that? You don't hear anything about that, do you? In fact, that's what they accuse Jesus of. You cast out demons by who? Beelzebub, right? So they go, you're an idolater. You're the wicked one. They understand one thing. They understand idolatry is wrong. So this plan that God has to shatter them will, in fact, work. As you go through chapter 8, that's the goal, is for them to really come to understand that. Now, moving forward to chapter 9. So chapter 8, I'm going to shatter you, but look, if you will come and turn to me and bind my testimony on your heart, it'll be okay. Then chapter 9 starts with another messianic prophecy. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into content the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he's made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Now that is a prophecy about Jesus. And you know it's a prophecy about Jesus because the New Testament quotes it. And Matthew will quote that passage and say, this is what Jesus did. Now, Zebulun and Naphtali, if you look up at that map, Zebulun and Naphtali, they're right at the northern edge there, right up there by Asher. And they're also right in that territory that in the New Testament we would refer to as Galilee. They're right in that area. Now, when Assyria and Babylon come in, they're going to come from the north. Guess who takes the brunt of their attack? If they're coming from the north, they come in down below. It's not going to be Judah who takes it first, is it? It's going to be Zebulun and Naphtali. They're going to see the gloom and the anguish. They're going to be the very first ones that Assyria and Babylon come in and really wreak havoc. And so in verse 1 here, when he says, there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish, it's speaking about what hasn't yet happened but is about to, which is Assyria and Babylon coming in and just causing havoc and anguish to those two tribes. Naphtali and Zebulun did just nothing but pain in the former times, but in the latter times, there's going to be something glorious that will shine a bright light there. In the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Now, there's another word for nations. What is it? Gentiles. Galilee of the Gentiles. When Jesus came and he walked on this earth, where did he grow up? Right up in that territory, didn't he? Up there in Nazareth. Where did he do a big chunk of his preaching? That's right. So he had a short time down with John the Baptist, and then the bulk of it he spends up in Galilee. And his first miracles. So that area of the world that's going to take a pummeling. He says, now in the latter times, that will be also where things begin to turn bright. So if you've ever wondered, why Galilee? Why there? Why have Jesus preach there? Well, this gives you some understanding of it. One, God said so, and that's enough. But two, he says they were the first to see the gloom and the anguish, so they will also be the first to see the glorious days of the coming of the Lord. There again, we have that picture. So, verse 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Once again, this is not talking about the past. This is now we're talking about those latter times, right? So, in the latter times, the glorious Jesus will come to Galilee of the Gentiles, and the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. That light, that's Jesus. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with the joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. Anybody remember the day of Midian? Who went to battle against the Midianites? Anybody remember? Who? Gideon. Yep, Gideon. See, it's always a kid's teacher who remembers it, right? It's Gideon, right? You teach the little kids at Gideon. Now, if you remember, in the day of Midian, in the day of the battle of Gideon, I didn't realize till I just said it that those two things rhyme. But Gideon goes to battle and he gathers initially this very large army. And God says, no, we're not going to have a lot of people go to battle. Anybody remember why? Why did God shrink that army down? Yep, that's it. He wanted them to know that it was God who was saving them. Not that they had such a big army, but that God had done it. So now, the comparison here is when that great light comes, that's Jesus, it'll be like in the day of Midian. Think about how the church began. It didn't begin with a big, massive amount of people. It began with a very small amount of people. And if you were to say, in the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, when it's just him and he's got a few apostles, and they're walking around and they're going 2 by 2 into the various cities, this is going to change the world fundamentally forever, nobody would have believed you. But it has. Just like in the day of Midian. Why? How? By the time you get to Paul's life, Paul would come into a city and they say, oh no, they've come here also, and they're trying to turn the whole world upside down. That's God. And that's what's being said here, is that light's going to shine. And when Jesus first shone, the people who knew him, people of his own hometown, what did they say when Jesus started preaching? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Didn't he grow up? Aren't his brothers and sisters here with us? Why would we listen to him? See, he was unimpressive. And Isaiah, we'll talk later on about that. Even physically, it just didn't stand out. All of these things, they are part of the plan that God would spread the gospel through a pathway that's a Gideon-like pathway. Not because of the might of man, not because of the numerical size of the beginning force, but in fact, it's a light that shone in a dark place, but it was the truth and God was with him. And so Christianity spread and covered the whole world. So then you get down, verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. So it's going to start out like Gideon fighting the battle, but because of who's in charge of the army, right? So Gideon, God's with Gideon, and it's a small army, but God gives the victory. Here, the head of the army is Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Who is that? That's Jesus, right? Now, because of that, you can say this kingdom, his government, it will have no end. It'll spread and spread and spread. Now, this is very reminiscent of what Daniel was told. You have that statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, and that statue represents 4 different kingdoms, and those 4 kingdoms get destroyed by a rock cut out without hands, meaning it came from God, not from men. And that rock destroys all of those kingdoms, but then turns into a great and mighty mountain. And how long will that mountain remain? It has no end. The kingdom will be forever. And so Daniel kind of mixes a couple of different things. Isaiah talks about the mountain and all the nations streaming to it back in chapter 2. And then here he talks about the government that will have no end and the kingdom that will exist forever. That is the kingdom that is the church. And Daniel kind of mixes those two in his picture. But here in Isaiah, the emphasis is upon the character of the king that will rule over them. He'll be a counselor. His name will be Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Now this is Jesus, and one of the ones that might throw you is it calls him Everlasting Father. Now, that's not normally a term you associate with Jesus, is it? And in fact, when you get to chapter 10, down in verse 21, the Father, the one that we typically refer to as the Father, Jehovah, is given that exact same name. Now, why would that be happening here? Why, when talking about Jesus, would he call him by the same name that you would give to Jehovah? What might be a reason for that? Establish his deity. Yeah, I think that's the point. Just like Emmanuel means God with us, when you call him Everlasting Father, you're saying, this one who comes, he won't just be a wonderful counselor. He'll be God. He'll be an everlasting Father. He'll be Prince of Peace. Now, when you look at Prince of Peace, we have a problem in our kind of American and European minds that we think of princes being kind of below kings. But when you talk about a prince, what you're talking about is royalty, right? And so he's royalty. He'll be royal. Now, in Isaiah 11, this is where we start putting pieces together. Isaiah 11, this same governor, wonderful counselor, will be talked about again. It says, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. Now, the emphasis here is that the king who will rule over his kingdom, which we know to be the church, Jesus, how is he going to rule? What's going to be the theme of his rule? Because every king has a different way of ruling, doesn't he? They have a different way of going about it. Some of them, they bribe the people. The Roman way of bread and circuses. We give the people what they want, and then all the people love us, and that'll work. Others rule through might. They crush everybody, and anybody who says anything, just wipe them out right away. How does this king rule? He's righteous. He does the right thing. He's a servant. Yeah, he has an attitude and disposition of understanding his people, being wise and thoughtful, being a counselor to them. Right? He's going to use wise counsel and provide wise counsel. And so he uses that might to lead the people to peace. And it's a beautiful thing when you put the pieces together. Okay. Now, one other place, and I'm not going to go there, but I just simply mention it for you. Go and compare those two discussions about the character of the Christ in Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 11. Compare that to Zechariah 6, because one of the things that Zechariah 6 will do is put together that not only will he be king, but he's going to combine the two offices of king and priest. Now, in Israel at that time, the king and the priest were different. They were separate from each other. But in Christ, the king is also the high priest. The one who rules is also the one who makes intercession for the sins of the people. And so he'll bring those two offices together. Now, in chapter 10, we're going to skip through a whole lot of that, but there's a discussion about the remnant. We talked about the remnant a fair bit last week. But chapter 11, just a couple small things to add as we finish up. Chapter 11 discusses the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him, like we read there in verse 2. But in verse 1, it says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse. Now, we've not talked about this much before, but Jesse is the father of David. And he says it's the stump of Jesse, meaning that whole thing is going to be lopped down. It's like a tree cut down. And as you look at the kings that come from David, by the time you get into Babylonian captivity, they're whacked down. We're done. But there's going to be a shoot that comes out of that stump. And that shoot is Jesus. And so he'll be a king that fills the role of king from the Davidic line, but does it with a character that was missing in the earthly kings. And then you get down to verse 6, and he says, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. Now, in verse 6, when it talks about a little child shall lead them, we've talked about a child who's going to lead earlier. Who is that? It's Jesus, right? He's the Emmanuel. And he's going to lead. And he's going to lead with that wisdom and counsel and Prince of Peace and all those things. And he's going to lead all of these creatures. Now, a wolf and a lamb and a leopard and a goat and a calf and a lion. What's the common theme amongst those pairs? Yeah, they're enemies, predator and prey. That's right. They don't get along at all. I think I mentioned that I was in Arizona holding a meeting, and there were two men sitting next to each other in that congregation. And one looked like he'd fallen into a tattoo parlor needle set. Everywhere. And the other guy was about as clean cut as you could imagine. One was a retired FBI agent. The other used to be a Hell's Angel. Enemies, now united. That's what's being talked about there. Okay, we'll shut down there. Pick up next week. Your reading for next week is chapter 24 through 27. What? I'll just leave you to guess.